All right, welcome everyone. It is June 2023. This is the Mark Fisher Flatline Constructs Reading Group. And today we are reading sections 3.5, 3.6, 3.6, and 3.7, starting with the wasp factory. And we're talking about propagation. We're talking about the biotics dissolving into machinics. And today's date is what? June 10th. So anyway, I developed some opening comments. I think one of the difficult things about this particular chapter is that there's a lot of redundancy, or at least there's a lot of cues to say things that appear to me to be as redundant, when considering things that I personally have talked about in previous episodes. However, one of the things that Fisher touches upon is the work of Baudrillard in this particular book. I don't know if anybody's ever picked up this compilation. This is like a book. It's not a series of essays. It's supposed to be a coherent set of essays. And I read the essay on immortality, which I think Baudrillard, I have a very conflicted relationship with. There are elements of his work that I tend to find politically reactionary, maybe even sort of like on the ontological or metaphysical level challenging. But I really appreciated what he writes in the section on immortality here, especially as it pertains to cybernetics. And so some of my comments are geared around unpacking what Baudrillard or what Fisher means, or might even mean beyond what he's written on the page, about what Gothic materialism is, because Baudrillard expresses what I think is a concept of the Gothic materialist viewpoint in such a salient way in that chapter on immortality. I mean, think of all of the horror movies or suspense thrillers out there where it's about capturing one's soul, or something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like that sort of horror dynamic is occupying the sentences on these pages. So just thinking from the section on the wasp factory going forward, the sentence that really stood out to me was, biotics dissolves into machinics, which it does not dialectically oppose, but cybernetically envelops. And here I understand Fisher to be saying that the cyberneticization of production, reproduction, and what is more aptly called replication in this text manifests out of this concept of involution, or creative involution, that they adopt from Deleuze and Guattari, that we've talked about so many times, in particularly in our reading group on 1,000 Plateaus, where we're talking about becoming animal, where this is a very salient concept. And it's operative here explicitly on the page in Fisher's dissertation. This concept of creative involution for Deleuze and Guattari is distinguished from evolution, the evolutionary model, which preserves the filiative structure of production through its successive iterations. The involutionary swarm machine deterritorializes the hive, like the wasp's hive, insofar as it breaks down the molar aspect of the hive overcoated by something like a queen, let's say, and disperses its power to propagate through its more molecular aspects. And so here, I think there's somewhat of an analog with Baudrillard's concept of the simulacra. I mean, that's something that's operative here too, where the liberation of code from the referent occurs via an involution of modes of propagation of code. And so for anyone who's read Symbolic Exchange and Death, they might be thinking of something like, the notably, like the advent of substances like stucco, for example. And I've extended that to the idea of plastic in my reading, where, with the advent of these particular materials through which we make certain objects or commodities, the plasticity of code becomes more manifest. And some of this, like I said, through stucco or plastic, like the one example that Baudrillard gives in Symbolic Exchange and Death that comes to mind is the ability for us with stucco to create an imitation of wood cornices and do it much more cheaply, and make the possibility of owning such a simulacra or simulacrum of that particular style of architecture much easier for like the working classes, or, the lower level aristocrats or something like that. And so I think about then how that then translates into the breaking down of code into the binary logic. and the cybernetic aggregation or transmission of in chunks or particles of metadata over time. So I'm thinking here about the successive breakdown of code from the strict referent, which Baudrillard describes in the first order simulacra, all the way to the simulacrum as we experience it now, particularly in today's society, where we can do things like occupy the space in the metaverse, for example. But I want to talk a little bit about the Baudrillard on immortality and the deterritorialization of the soul. The one thing that's kind of operative underneath Fisher's text is, this idea of a humanism, or this idea of the solidity of the human being dissolved by, the Gothic line. And Baudrillard has his own version of that. And I just kind of wanted to read off some things that he says that I've kind of interpreted for our purposes. For Baudrillard, the fetishization of the cybernetic technologies allows for a very strict literalness of the same in its reproduction. And he writes that this is, I think, is the most interesting part. The literal artificiality supersedes the immaterial prosthesis of the soul. So he thinks about the soul, as we understand it in like Augustine or in religious works, as this immaterial prosthesis. And how is it the case? Well, it's an extension of our life beyond the dissolution of our body, right? It's how we, come to merge with God, or it's where we go when we die. We go into heaven. It's the extension of our life. Well, what happens is that concept is deterritorialized by the cybernetic by creating an infinite deferral of death, in a very materialized way, and perhaps in a way that we can say is immanentized. And so my claim is that the cyberpunk present also transfigures the reality of mammalian sexed death. So, Baudrillard has this thing about the sort of sexed and non-sexed propagation that we see in Fisher's text. And it's through the cybernetic, it's for Baudrillard, it almost seems regressive to him, because what he says is it returns us to this milieu of what he calls an unceremonious molecular death, right? So, we might think one of the positive upshots of the cyberpunk present is for us to experience the ecstasy of depersonalization. But for Baudrillard, it appears not only as a banality, but as a kind of horror. And so Baudrillard draws this allusion to a systematic death machine. And he draws an analogy between that and Nazi concentration camps, which he believes were apparatuses whose function actually served to deprive prisoners of their deaths, in the sense that the extermination meant the utter depersonalization of death, the death of death, as it were. So being in a concentration camp, being assigned a number, being forced to dig one's own grave and then to die in it, is this sort of perverse, this sort of perverse way of robbing one's death from us, and the sort of the meaningfulness that could potentially surround it. The death of death is accelerated in those machinic innovations which seek to create life in the form of an indestructible life process in two ways. And so here, I don't know if you've talked, if you remember me talking on the I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream episode, and my critique of, these technologies where we attempt to immortalize ourselves. Well, Baudrillard has a similar critique, and it resonates with me. And he says there's two ways in which this horror comes into being. One is through the autonomization of the creative apparatuses, or two, by a reduction to its smallest possible elements, a molecularization of the propagation of life. And now what I think might be the reactionary element here is this elevation of the figure of the solid human, right? And so maybe that's something that we can talk about. And this is a kind of critique that Adam somewhat leveled at me, with respect to this ambition to become immortal. Just because we're born in this body in this particular way doesn't mean it has to be that way. But the question is, what are the risks, or what are the dangers posed when we submit ourselves to the kinds of technology that not only threaten to undermine our humanity, which might be fine. Maybe there's a kind of depersonalization that is positive in some ways, but now with its, inexorable attachment to capital, perhaps this depersonalization is more hideous than we might have initially imagined. And so just a couple more comments. Baudrillard sees the articulation of these prospects as the erasure of our destiny. He talks about the death of our destiny, or the absence of destiny itself. And a sort of connection that I made is, whereas Sartre says that man is condemned to freedom, the cyberpunk present for Baudrillard means that we are condemned to a kind of immortality. And he states that in no uncertain terms, that this is the worst fate that we can endure. And so just one last comment on Baudrillard and the soul. I believe that Baudrillard conceives of the soul as a metaphorical appendage. He says this, but which imbues the organism with its futurity. And so this is the idea that interests me, is that there's a concept of soul that attends to our futurity, the future of our lives, the telos of our lives, where we end up, and so forth. Can we think about the soul in terms of an ever immediate present? Because for Baudrillard, it's not operative in that way. Conversely, the logic of the cybernetic prosthetic collapses the futurity of immortality into the complete molecular autonomy and digitality of the cyberpunk present. So this is the risk. We can kind of have an immediacy. We can kind of have an ever immanentizing force of life that stands to erase one's individual identity, or seep through the pores of what we believe to be our solid identity, but of course ever engendering this risk of complete dissolution. A world without soul is not one without life. This is me. A world without soul is not one without life, but one without death. So with that said, I'll pass it to Adam, and then we'll see what other people have to say.
Well, of course, yeah, the great figure of the immortal in what Fisher's referencing is, of course, the figure of Ashpool from Neuromancer, who's essentially a corpo, sort of basically essentially the emperor of one of the biggest corporations, which has created these AIs, but is constantly fending off, cloning himself. It's very similar to, actually, in the game Cyberpunk 2077, the head of the Arasaka Corporation essentially wants to transfer his mind into his kids. Imagine in a way like if Succession simply ended with Brian Cox never dying, but simply constantly transferring his consciousness to more and more people, and constantly, or maybe even something like what's a similar cyberpunk fictional element? Mr. House, for example, from Fallout New Vegas, constantly trying to fight off death infinitely, essentially trying to maintain the soul, trying to maintain the semblance of an identity, which allows them to maintain a very patriarchal, capitalist control over these systems as their owner. And of course, similarly, we have also the figure of Tyrell from Blade Runner. These people that create these new forms of life, it's indifferent, but rather just to think about Fisher's work on Flatline, the idea of Flatline is it's indifferent to whether it's alive or not. It doesn't matter whether Frankenstein's monster is the same kind of life as the special enlightenment idea of the human. It doesn't matter in the same way if Wintermute, the AI, is the same kind of individualistic bourgeois, the bourgeois subject as we think of it. It doesn't matter if Roy Batty and the replicants from Blade Runner sort of don't fit the sort of bourgeois subject here. What Fisher's trying to think through here is how the images we get in cyberpunk fiction express a fundamental sort of incompatibility with these new kind of informational cybernetic technologies and the bourgeois subject of capitalism, which for them is always identified with this very singular, individual, humanistic sort of Kantian framework of a very standardized mode of experiencing things. And so the question is, in cyberpunk fiction, for example, is really, how do these machinic forces, which are considered to be very demonic, they're unleashed, they're legion, they're spreading like viruses, how do they propagate if they're going to be something that's not human in the way we understand it? And from the previous section, we were talking about becoming animal, particularly the idea of contagion. They spread like viruses, they propagate through making allegiances with sort of the idea of the human and spreading through them. I mean, this is an idea which is very central to a lot of cyberpunk, which is ultimately sort of abandoned in contemporary cyberpunk, because, I mean, the best example of this is Cyberpunk 2040. What's it called? 2049, that's it. When it's, the grand messianic thing which brings them back into this kind of new humanity of the people to come is that one of them actually reproduces in this very standard sort of humans of aliens of giving birth kind of way in cyberpunk is in Blade Runner 2049. But before this sort of counter revolution happens, Fisher's really trying to think through how to think about ways in which these new processes which are escaping the bourgeois subject, escaping kind of fundamentally bourgeois conception of the human, how they can ally with other things outside of that framework, and also how we can ally with them. Because this is the CCRU fundamentally. The idea is that there is a minor humanity or a minor process which one can ally with, and it's embodied in all of these speculative fictions about technology, but also in technologies already arriving upon the scene, particularly for them, the internet. And of course, this didn't go fantastically well, but there's nonetheless there are still ways in which people use the internet and information technology to escape, to construct new identities outside of hegemonic identities. I mean, this is one of the great ways which people have been able to experiment with gender plasticity and sort of self-presentation, and also to a lesser extent stuff like biohacking. And this is very much in the mind of the CCRU people at this point, of course, because the common refrain here is that sort of the main concerns of the CCRU were not this sort of Landian, Lovecraftian solely, let's go find the evil thing and then just go, tell it how much we love it so it won't kill us. It's not Roko's basilisk. It's really this particularly kind of, well, for example, Sadie Plant, sort of the idea of a feminist remodeling of the body, sort of a queer escape from a hegemonic idea of the human. So just to sort of situate this in terms of the wider scope of Flatline constructs, and this is the end of part 3, Xerox and Xenogenesis, which is all about these questions of looking at cyberpunk to rethink ways of social reproduction, or other ways in which machinic processes can allow us to map out ways of escaping hegemonic means of social reproduction. For example, and this is the most quintessential model of social reproduction is the gender division of labor, particularly the forcing of women into reproductive labor. And fundamentally, this is a challenge to that, but through sort of a backdoor of cyberpunk fiction. I mean, there's a lot of concepts we could really unpack a lot here, particularly the ideas of, for example, isophrenia. So isophrenia, it's meant to be a counterposition to schizophrenia. Now, obviously, very delicate subject. We should sort of recognize that there's schizophrenia as a process that they're talking about, and schizophrenia as a clinical entity. And by clinical entity, I mean diagnostic category. It's a category of, if schizophrenia means this, and this, you fit in that box. But there's also a process of schizophrenia in which the self or an identity becomes ruptured. And when he's talking about schizophrenia, he's really talking about that process. And that's similar with isophrenia, which is essentially a kind of a madness which tries to constantly reproduce itself eternally and indefinitely without difference. And we can kind of see the social relations of capital being very much like this. It's even, thinking about the model of Ashpool from Neuromancer, this old corporate hierarchy. Yes, capitalism is very different. It creates a lot of differences in terms of products, economies, so-called innovations. But ultimately, the people, the bourgeoisie themselves, the subjects of capital, or the subjects who see themselves as capital, or rather are in the position of directing capital, they do not want this differentiation. They are trying to keep things the same, which is why they don't like inheritance tax, for example. They have the greatest investment in keeping a sort of a familial inheritance-based semi-feudal structure going for them. It's why, I mean, to give a pretty strong example of this, Sam Altman, the open AI people, they do not want, there's no one who's more against the free market than a capitalist in a burgeoning industry. His whole thing going around saying, for example, he said it in the UK recently, AI is going to destroy humanity. Is it? Well, yeah, that's why you've got to give me and all of my friends just an artificial monopoly on it, so then we can make sure it doesn't kill you all. Now, sadly, I mean, I was talking to a friend today. The worst thing that could happen for these people is AI does kill them all, but actually, it's just going to kill them. Because ultimately, if AI was going to do any sort of utilitarian calculation, it would definitely see who was doing most of the damage. So it's not that when sort of Henry Kissinger says that AI is going to kill us, us is a very class notion right there. He doesn't mean the rest of us. He means his lot. So I don't think we should be as scared of that. But that is really the sort of the corporate, sort of familial, very scared structure that Fisher's talking about here. Particularly, we think about the ideas of positive versus negative feedback. Negative feedback moves against the direction of travel of any system or any body in a system, and positive feedback is this self-reinforcing loop which starts spiraling. The isophrenic here, Ashpool, these corporate people are trying to hold themselves against this computer technology, or these new technologies which are escaping them. They are trying to keep things the same. They are doing negative feedback in the sense of, what is positive feedback? Aging is a positive feedback process. We tend to die of positive feedback quite a lot. But negative feedback is really moving against the direction of travel of a body, which is aging. Countering aging is a negative feedback process, usually done visually. And well, what they want to do instead is, instead of this isophrenia, is a schizophrenia process, essentially a self-reinforcing escape from these forces, well, from these social configuration, these social machinics. And so the question of Fisher is how do they propagate themselves, and how do we ally with them, or how do we see images of them through these cyberpunk texts? And this is why Neuromancer is so sort of fundamental for him. It's interesting as well because the section is called The Wasp Factory, which is also a novel by Ian M. Banks, which is not a cyberpunk novel at all, but is very much concerned with differences of the body, the plasticity of gender, and social reproduction. So I don't know how that truly fits in. If anyone has ever read that book, I haven't, but it might be something useful to pick up on. But with that, I'll pass it on to Craig.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of things that I could say in addition to what I said. I think when we get to there's 2 3.6s, and hopefully in the future there'll be a new version of Flatline Constructs. It would be nice to see it published by an imprint that we're all familiar with, but we'll see if that happens or not. Wink, wink. But anyway, I think the second 3.6 contains a line and a concept that I've been harping on for a while, which is the idea of the sorceress narrative, or the idea of a demonological sorcery. And Fisher draws on the example that I've locked into, quite strongly, to explicate this particular term. And, I guess I have questions or concerns, rather than me just kind of recapitulating, what I had said in previous reading group discussions, whether it's the 1,000 Plateaus one or this one here. I'd be curious to sort of just like advance a question here, because by the time that we get to page 131 in this dissertation, we get a sense that this particular reading of Deleuze and Guattari leans so heavily on not only the idea of, the cyberpunk present, as it's understood in this book, but also the notion of capital and capitalism and the propagation of the axiomatic of capital. And one of the ways that, I've tried to read the Becoming Animal Plateau, in our upcoming book, and it's not a very thorough section of our book, but it's definitely not a grace note, is how to think through this idea of conspiracy or demonological sorcery as a counter movement to filiative processes, right? And Deleuze and Guattari envision it as a kind of transversal process. And if we bring in Baudrillard, as Fisher does here, there's this counterposition of a kind of the sexuality of the filiative processes against the unsexed propagation of what we could understand as transversal, demonological, conspiratorial processes. How is it that alliances can or are able to outside of, filiative processes, just to repeat myself. And I find this to be so politically important in today's world, especially in the United States, especially in Britain. We talk so much about gender and LGBTQ struggles. And I mean, that seems to be like one of the dominant fronts upon which the idea of filiative propagation versus transversal propagation is actually, that is one of the primary fields of contestation, not simply in terms of sexuality, but also the propagation of various political intensities. You know, I mean, think about the ways in which, you know, the very transversal nature, of gender and gender struggles and so forth, tends to the possibility, if not, you know, real forms of political action outside of gender, maybe those which contend with the notion of class, those which contend with the notion of labor, and so on and so forth. And so it seems that when we hit, you know, that sort of peak of cultural anomie, or we're thrust into yet another one of the peaks or valleys of, you know, the ongoing crisis of capital, you know, you have somebody like a Ron DeSantis, or you have some, you know, someone like a British MP, for example, who, you know, wants to invoke, you know, gender roles, the family, and so on and so forth, to the extent that, you know, we might think perhaps the sort of primary upshot of that politics is to fit somebody into the family mold, but really in a sort of anti-Oedipal sort of way, you know, the long-term upshot is that it creates, you know, a mechanism by which to rein in these other sort of political intensities that could manifest, for example, as another politics. I mean, I think of those instances in which, you know, people try to overcome, you know, rent schemes by piling into an apartment or a house and so forth. And, you know, in conjunction with landlords, the local officials will combat that, you know, whether it's the mayor or the governor, by saying, you can only have X number of people in a house and they must be related in this sense. And, you know, they make all of these stipulations that attend to this figure of the family, you know, the sort of Oedipal figure of the family, nuclear family, imposed upon, you know, this economic structure as a way to preempt or cut off, you know, folks overcoming, you know, or exploiting gaps, you know, in the sort of economic structure of a locality, you know, so people can save a little bit of money, you know, and get out of that rent scheme because the landlords want to get paid, and so on and so forth. And so I say all of that because I want to be able to think this political process not merely in terms of the cyberpunk aesthetic, although there might be a cybernetic dimension to what is happening here. And so when I think of the accelerationist fragment in Deleuze and Guattari, you know, that we must take this process further. You know, one of the ways that this idea has attempted to have been actualized is through people like Mark Fisher and Nick Land and so forth. But I think there's another side to it. You know, I think the politics of it simply isn't machines in terms of chunky tech or like nanotechnology. You know, like, what does the politics of, you know, of desubjectivation look like as an escape from these very technologies of capture? You know, how is that logic replicated in a way that either disavows or overcomes, you know, the sort of investment of capital, you know, that's required to propagate the technologies themselves? And so that's just a question that's been on my mind as I read this. And I'd just be curious to hear, yeah, I mean, you don't have to respond exactly to what I have said, but I just advance that as a kind of question that for me has been looming over the reading of this entire text. And feel free to hop in.
Could you repeat the end of that question?
Could you repeat the
I'm
whole
so
thing?
sorry.
Well, I think the condensed way, the condensed version of my question is this. We're thinking through, I mean, Fisher here is using the work of Deleuze and Guattari and this idea of a propagation of a desubjectivated subject, right? A subject that's unable to be pinned down by the apparatuses of capital, the apparatuses of the state, that is always moving in excess of it. And there's a way in which we can think about, you know, the cybernetics as it attends to capitalism as a process that's always already ongoing. And I mean, I think this is evidenced in the way that, you know, for example, even social media platforms in their development tend to outstrip the laws that we make around them. Like, we create these things, of AI, for example. We create them, we unleash them, we see what they can do. Then regulators kind of come in, and then the sort of moral discourse comes in and tries to rein it all in. But usually the genie's already out of the bottle. And what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is like, look at what's happening over there. Like, look at what capital can do. It has this amazing capacity to overcome social codes and, these, and even the kind of bulwarks that we set up, not only juridically, but also socially against, this form of propagation. And I think the challenge that Deleuze and Guattari put to us, when we read what they call the accelerationist fragment, is like, how can we take this process further? I think the question that they're asking is like, how can we maximize capital gains or something, or how can we maximize profit? That's not what they're asking. What they're asking is, how can we develop a politics that stands in acknowledgement of the utter plasticity, the utter celerity, and the utter intelligence of this movement. And maybe there's better descriptors for that than maybe intelligence, but I think speed and plasticity certainly have something to do with it. And how do we transpose that onto a politics of liberation? Because as far as I see it, I mean, and this is just my political opinion about it, this stuff didn't save us, and it's not coming to save us. And if anything, we are participating in it in such a way that it's allowing it to recuperate the very mechanisms of constraint and recording that keep us from being free. And so, then, the question is, well, maybe Deleuze and Guattari are wrong about that. Maybe there isn't a way to get away from it by outpacing it somehow. Maybe there's, maybe the politics of refusal involve, a complete turning away from it. Do we assume this sort of Luddite posture, for example? Or is it possible to really speed up the process? Meaning, what does it look like for assemblages, groups to, adopt a kind of logic or manifest a logic that is akin to what's happening in the cybernetic field, in order to overcome its oppressive aspects? And so I think I see that as the kind of political problematic, or at least that's the political problematic that I'm putting forward against all of the things that I'm kind of reading right now. But I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what others have to say. And maybe Adam has something too. I don't mind if you jump in, Adam.
If I can jump in, I think it's like pretty clear. Yes, it is not coming to save us, but like it did deterritorialize us, and then reterritorialize us, and reterritorialize and deterritorialize, and like kind of that hyper acceleration of that process, I feel like made the process less ignorable for people, which I think is one of the things that, like, in terms of like politically online people, they've watched like all their lifestyles, be it like a traditional family or like a radical queer existence, become a sort of like be presented back to them as a sort of like political LARP that you're all doing. And it kind of maybe gave this mirror that like, well, shit, maybe it was a LARP all the time. Maybe my identity was always a persona I built for a reason, and not like some sort of innate way of being a human. And I think like people on, especially on the conservative side, like don't like that. They don't like to think of their traditional, like a social media profile that's about a traditional family, like living off the land in Utah and expounding those values to probably sell jerky. Like they don't like to know that that's a fake identity that they have like territorialized themselves with. It is not like, no, they want it to be like a sort of natural rhythm of humanity. And so I feel like what cybernetics kind of perpetuated was there's like, it sort of deconstructed a natural rhythm of humanity, or at least pushed it into like a very primitive place of like raw emotional, like there's compassion, there's kindness, there's anger, and but like there's not like a traditional male role or a traditional female role in that. Those are all things you populate like the raw emotional field with it. Like those are all codes you put, that you could just as easily decode and then recode. And I don't think people, like online people, have really been able to keep up with that. Like, so it's like, and like, I think what Deleuze and Guattari, like the way of sort of like, if like cybernetics coming in faster and faster is the breeze. Like the way of beating the breeze isn't to try to blow ahead of it or like be faster than the breeze. You just have to become like a mesh, like something the breeze can pass through more effectively. And you can just sort of ride that wave as a sort of like holy space. And I think that's sort of like, if anything, like Deleuze and Guattari and like Mark Fisher and like this text is kind of giving me, it's like, oh, okay, like I need to be able to like rock with it, not like try to be ahead of it or totally remove yourself from it, which seems to be more and more impossible every day.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and important perspective on it, because and I think the thing that you point out too, like, there's this idea of a kind of lifestyleism. Like, and I'm just thinking about the sort of politics and culture in America, that the opposing lifestyles that we could, like, just take anybody who's, like you said, you have this radical queer identity, and then you have, the whole back to blue, sort of like we support our troops, local police identity. I mean, the one thing that connects them in our time, there is a kind of plane of consistency between all identities, in the sense that they both populate, social media feeds, they populate the commodity form, and they do so in a kind of flattened out sort of way. I mean, hell, even Acid Horizon does it. We got t-shirts, we got the social media, we got the YouTube. So does every other, sort of political outlet. And I think, in one aspect, I think we do have to stand in the brute acknowledgement, like, this is a sort of plane upon which today's politics is playing out. And the question then remains, what are the escapes? What are, what are the sort of postures that allow us to thrive and persist amidst this? But perhaps at the same time, like, one of the, the longstanding risks in all of this is that, well, capital may be as strong as it's ever been. Maybe there's a new crisis coming, or we could all be beset by poverty in the next 2 or 3 months if the economy crashes, and so on, and all of this sort of online play, and this exchange of identities and so forth, may come on to take a very different meaning, or a sort of different character, like once people's livelihoods are threatened, or like now rents are twice as much, or a family can't buy a home or something like that, and people's opportunities start evaporating. And maybe this is a kind of first world problem here, but I don't know. I don't want to confuse this too much, but I think it is interesting to point that out. I think you've tapped into like an important part of the problem, which is, as you said, seeing that identity kind of floats on the surface of like whatever this plane of consistency is. One of the questions is how we ride this wave, where it can take us. What are the safety nets that we need so that our experiments don't fall apart? And I think that is very much a part of what Deleuze and Guattari are, sort of imploring us to consider. Anyone else have anything? Questions, comments?
Howdy. Yeah, no, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about like because I know Fisher uses Marshall McLuhan a lot in this essay, and that really like got me thinking about like what you're saying now about this plane of consistency between the medium of mass communication and how it's used to kind of propagate hegemony and like the ways that can be used, especially now that it's like more universally available. But like I do wonder, I guess, if you could elaborate a little bit on like, I guess, why the use of like these technologies kind of keeps that plane of consistency. Like why is it the same just because it's like the medium is used? I don't know.
Go for it, Adam.
Well, so the reason why these technologies elaborate upon a plane of consistency is the plane of consistency is all it really means is it's similar to a cybernetic viewing of things, where if you present things in terms like a diagram, in terms of their function. So, before it would be, there'd be like an author, an authority, which says this means this. I dictate the message and then it is sent. But when the medium is the message, this hierarchy of the authority of who dictates it, which is always authority. Philosophically, it's always been very much this transcendental subject which sets its own boundaries or formally limits its own knowledge and allows the human to become like a separate individual thing, which is autonomous, makes some choices, and is fundamentally considered to be like a bourgeois thing that manifests itself in property. Now, the play consistency is essentially a new way of viewing these situations, because when you look at things cybernetically, it's essentially just flat. It's there's no sort of domination coming from the outside of experience in the form of like a transcendental subject, like an I, like an I think therefore I am, or an I think which stands outside the world. Rather, the organization of the system is immanent to the system itself, because it's fundamentally about different flows of activity and what sort of configurations basically emerge out of this more like a habit than a principle. And so when McLuhan, the idea that the medium is the message, now essentially it flattens out that hierarchy. It's no longer the person that writes the message. It's the person who has final say on it, because the message is a coding of a certain flow of direct. So I'm coding a flow of like letters by writing on them. And however, now there's always a surplus value. I mean, similar to, for example, this is quite one of the funniest things about Twitter, for example. One can write something and it can leave sort of one's target audience and become completely re-territorialized somewhere else, and suddenly everyone's mad at you. So like, I really love pancakes. 5 minutes later, oh, so you fucking ate waffles, do you? Like, it makes its way onto waffle Twitter and it's all gone. That is a surplus value of code, because the circulation essentially destroys any authority one has over the message, because the message is such a medium that's constantly in motion, that authority is destroyed. I mean, it's very similar to viruses, for example. It's something I'm working on right now, really. The virus doesn't have a proofreading ability. A retrovirus can write a code into the DNA of a cell and then send that cell off on its way, but it can't proofread it. There's always constantly other codes, chemical functions, always in that environment that could modify it. And so really what the idea of the play consistency here is to destroy the authority of any external component that dictates what's going on there. These technologies, I mean, obviously there's a limit to this, which sort of CCIU somewhat find out quite quickly, which is that the platforms themselves are all owned and control can be exercised in that way. And ultimately, even if these machines don't have a transcendent author, there's still a politics of who owns them and who gets to propagate them and who gets to disassemble them. And so I think there's a limit there. But the plane consistency really is this grand horizontalization of, it's not like there's like a register that's separate above this system, whereas the author, in a way that viruses don't have an author. No one's like, I'm writing a code for this, it's going to go spread. That's the conspiratorial factor. And instead, actually, it's all flattening down, it's accelerating, possibly faster. And this is the sort of the gambit than the people know themselves. And that is somewhat true, at least insofar as, the people who made, for example, social media platforms are also kind of servants to them as well. Yes, I mean, why doesn't Mark Zuckerberg cash out of his billions and go live a better life than any of us are possibly able to live ever? Why does Elon Musk do what he like? Imagine, like, this is what he's doing with the money that the entire world system has produced him to do. He's doing this shit, for fuck's sake. I mean, these people have to, the ruling class of so much of our planet has had its brains rewritten by its own internal communication devices, which they mainly just wanted to use to order coffee, or in the case of the United States and the internet, to coordinate the US government after a mass nuclear war. But now they're addicted to it. It's even similar to some of the reports actually coming out of Kabul, actually, after sort of when the sort of the insurgency stops. They're sort of complaining that a lot of these former insurgents are now working in offices and are addicted to Twitter. It is rather these machines are highly addictive, and they flatten the authority that humanity supposedly have on them, in a similar way to how that we can the richest people on the planet don't necessarily own anything. You can be incredibly rich and not. I mean, the current prime minister of the UK is the richest one we've ever had, he doesn't really own it. He's he's more of a manager of these systems. He's more of a servant to them. And so the economic and material conditions of the economy itself have themselves become completely horizontalized, but flattened into simple diagrams, processes, what produces returns, what produces profit, rather than any kind of, they're not doing it for themselves in the same way that they used to. It's no longer as semi-feudal as that. I mean, I hope that answers some of your question about McLuhan and like.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that too. I think there's kind of an example that I can give that maybe can help us think that a little bit better. I mean, the question is, do you have a subjectivity in this advanced capitalist world? Of course you do. Of course you do. You have your social media thumbprint, right? Everything that you've ever liked, everything that you've ever clicked. Twitter knows how fast you've scrolled over certain posts, how long you've lingered over others. And the thing of it is insofar as we maintain the conceit that we do maintain a subjectivity, the way that this connects to the Gothic flatline, or maybe what we could call the more extensive or intensive libidinal membrane that connects everything else, is the uptake of that metadata, not simply as your individual subjectivity, but really the desubjectivation that's being produced is the conglomeration or the aggregation of all of that data and its usage to organize and reorganize production in certain ways that then falls back upon our individualistic or individually subjective attitudes about, how and why we use that particular technology. So, for example, my wife, she doesn't use social media. You're on YouTube every night, clicking like on this, watching that video, getting things advertised to you, and then you're jumping on Amazon and they know what you're getting. And then one night she admits to me, she's like, you know what? I love Amazon. I love Amazon because you can get the thing that you want that is not going to be in the store. And over time, having those habits rewritten at the individual level, not just with one individual, but all individuals, then radically transforms the way that we not only produce things, but where we store things, how we transport things. And that massive, intensive libidinal membrane that is capital is so radically different than what we understand as not only our individual, but perhaps our group subjective and intersubjective relationships, because the transmissions of those signals cybernetically are doing something that cannot be captured or circumscribed what we ordinarily understand as subjectivity. And maybe this is one of the ways that we can understand a kind of desubjectivation. The problem, as I see it, for the political problematic that I'd like to put forward is, what does that look like in terms of escaping those apparatuses insofar as they oppress us? And, Sean's answer has been, well, we got to find a way to flow with them. And I think, you know what, maybe Sean in the end is right about that, because our individual livelihoods and our family livelihoods, or whatever group that we, associate with, depends in part on the metastability of the systems that, are emerging and evolving over time. One can refuse up to a certain point, but the question is, if we do want to make a radical shift, that refusal has to be either infused or propagate in a way that moves beyond or matches or somehow imitates the logic of capital and semio-capital, like whatever's happening in this libidinal membrane that I'm talking about. It has to happen at a level that equals its pace or outstrips it somehow. That's my claim.
You can also make them scared. Elon Musk is a very scared man. He didn't need to be. You could make these people very scared by drawing these things on social media and Etch a Sketch. But yeah.
I'm curious if anybody had any comments. We don't have to talk about that specifically. We can take a tangent. Maybe something stuck out to you in the text, something that you thought was interesting, unusual, lingering question, maybe about something that you read earlier. Yeah, go ahead, Joris.
I wanted to bring something in that I read in another book, which is more of an economic angle, but it's connected to me to the idea of the infinite extension of life, or pushing away of death, which is so where does this start? I'm not that good at explaining things.
Take your time.
When you, in an economy, you have a currency, right? Traditionally, in like Middle Ages economies, for example, this would be a coin with the king's head on it. Now, often this would be done, and this is probably familiar knowledge to some of you, if not all of you, but the way that this works sometimes is the king will take out a massive loan from the national banks. And this loan, this debt that the king now has, becomes the basis for the value of the currency. Now, it's kind of funny because it is only the belief in this debt, that almost subconscious belief in this debt, that maintains the value of the currency. If everyone actually went to the king and said, we want our money, the system would fall apart. And that, funnily enough, would regularly happen. So then the monarch falls and you replace him with another one, you reissue the currency, and your economy's up and running again. What's funny is when that system transitions into a distributed kind of debt, which I'm from the Netherlands, don't dox me. And that's one of the first places where you could buy this monarchical debt as a member of the populace in the form of shares. Funnily enough, the Netherlands is also one of the first places where you start seeing enormous economic bubbles. For example, the tulip inflation, where at some point there was so much investment in the idea of the selling of tulips in the future that a tulip became worth an insane amount of money. So what I read, which is in a book by anthropologist David Graeber, was that in this case in the Netherlands, it was actually, this is where capitalist future shares economy was the most dangerous, because the Netherlands actually had a secure enough economy and monarch that people would believe in its actual value, in the continuation in the future of this same capitalist economy, hence leading to these massive bubbles, which would then lead to an economic crash. I was just reminded of that idea, and I have a bunch of questions around that. Like, obviously, we could take an easy accelerationist angle, maybe early accelerationist, and say, well, why don't we just wait for the whole thing to crash and burn itself out? But on the other hand, we know capital kind of lives by these phoenix moments. So yeah.
No, that's great, George. I mean, the first thing that it makes me think of is the very futurity of capital and the way that capital depends on the future or an image of the future. I mean, just to make an investment function, right? I think something similar happened during the American Revolution, where the colonists essentially developed their own counter currency against that of the British. That was based almost purely, it was backed purely on revolutionary aspirations, right? Whereas I don't know, what was the British currency founded on at that time, gold or silver or something like that. But, you know, at least at that moment in history, there was, you know, a kind of rupture or an interruption in the currency, insofar as the revolution was seen as the basis for investment, you know, the possibility of escaping British rule. Yeah, so I think that's a very apt notice. I don't know if anyone else wants to hop in on that.
It's very similar to what we was talked about in our episode with Colin Drum as well, essentially, because Britain is the synthesis of the British and Netherlands systems is basically, with William Orange coming up, is basically what creates the modern world capitalist sort of model. it's kind of where the beast is born, so to speak. But when it comes to acceleration, I mean, the accelerationism that Fisher sort of tends to think about is essentially, if anything, acceleration is kind of banal, isn't it? It's, oh, why don't we do the thing that's going to get us the thing we want faster? Fucking hell, never thought of that before. It's pretty trivial in that basic sense of, well, because there's so much, there's such an esoteric idea, accelerationism. And it indulges in that esotericness very much through Nick Land's. But then if you get down to it's what we should do, all the things we should do faster. But rather what it is, it's identifying, I think what I think best we can think about it is it's identifying tendencies which are already accelerating and then making an allegiance with them. And then sort of, or trying to compose something that accelerates that acceleration or taps into it. This is definitely true of the later Fisher. He's like, it's the unity of socialist feminist, Essence Communism is the unity of socialist feminist conscious raising, sort of hippie psychedelia, and trade unionism. It's those three. It's things that are already going to be accelerating in any capitalist society because it's kind of shit to live in. It requires a hegemonic gendering for social reproduction, and it requires a sort of delimitation of consciousness and advance, especially in the time that Fisher's writing. So it's rather tapping into accelerations that are already happening. I think that's so much of some way that becomes, yes, we should do more of the thing, or the worst version ever. Things have to get worse before they get better, kind of thing. It's which was, let's be honest, a real tendency, especially amongst sort of the far right. The idea is that we will cause a crisis and then people will rise. It's actually just propaganda indeed. There's nothing accelerationist about it, but it is. I think there is sort of the problem now after this accelerationist moment in the 90s is, well, one, because the technology, but they did bloom, and this is where we're still here, but also where do we find this accelerating aspect? I mean, for the French left in the sort of 60s and 70s, I mean, even just most communist parties around were third worldists in that sense. They were the accelerating tendency, and even now, I think really is I think it is probably something like the global South to be the accelerating tendency, because materially there's not much of an interest in accelerating. Anything accelerating sort of is its own sort of deterioration into fascism. So the question is, I guess, if there's something accelerating, how do we sort of demonically, make this kind of allegiance with it? And this allegiance will be a kind of solidarity, but will we know what it is, where it is until it's too late?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question for me. I think there was a time, and I'm imagining that all of us who are in this room at least at one time felt the kind of pull of the accelerationist argument, insofar as maybe you either believed it or you felt the strength of it, because it kind of plays upon, well, I mean, there's a sort of Marxist dimension to it too, but it's interesting to see to consider the sort of Nietzschean roots of accelerationism, not only as it appears in Deleuze and Guattari, who I mean, they're referencing Nietzsche's work directly, but also in Nick Land's work, which has just such a strong Nietzschean grounding in the sense that we can see how he's drawing upon Nietzsche. But the one thing that I often think about, and which attends to our conversation here today, is the role of the future in Nietzsche's thought. And admittedly, I don't have a complete grasp or like a fully fleshed out thesis on this yet. And perhaps this is something that I'm considering working on, as a few of us might begin work on a book on Nietzsche together. But the idea, for example, how there is no fixed futurity in Nietzsche's work. And I think one of the modern thinkers who most closely approximates that, or is perhaps faithful to that premise in Nietzsche's work, is somebody like Bataille, for example, who is associated with the accelerationist movement loosely, but ultimately, I think the idea of the kind of embodiment in the present moment that Bataille lifts up for us over and above other interpreters of Nietzsche, I think is important to consider against the conceit of the accelerationist, which is about achieving this future or tearing ourselves out of this out of this body. I mean, I think about how the actual human body was, so important in Nietzsche's work as that which was forgotten throughout the history of philosophy, as that which was disavowed from everyone from Plato to Kant and so on. And then when we finally get back into the body with Nietzsche, the next thing that we're doing in accelerationism and in Land's accelerationism, we're trying to get out of it so that we can achieve the AI singularity. I mean, here in Flatline Constructs, it's not that it's simply a matter of getting out of the body, but observing the fact that the flatline itself is the already in progress deterritorialization of the body into something like, Lyotard's libidinal skin. I use this term libidinal membrane. In somebody like Deleuze, the idea of becoming a individual, just this massive collective corpus of metadata, these fragments that we're all divided into, as overtaking our actual bodies. But the one thing that, remains a question for me is, can we inhabit our bodies autonomously, whether it's as individuals, as a groups, and affirm the flesh body, or are we consigned to a kind of new flesh, as it were? Which way Western man, I guess, is the question here. But anyway, Sean, you got something, go for it.
I feel like the times I feel most embodied are when I'm like kind of feeling like a raw emotionality about a thing. Like when I see, like, a lot of the times it's when I see like an animal, like in nature suffering or something. Like I see like, the other day I saw some, like, they installed some netting in the top of a parking garage to get, like, keep birds out. And there were some birds trapped in the netting that were now just sealed in there in like the Arizona heat. And like, I was like, yeah. And I was just like, yeah, there's like a lot of feelings that moved me to try and solve that problem. And those feelings were pretty much individual. Like they weren't really tied to any sort of identity or as a person in that moment. It was very like sort of a primitive animism place, which they talk about later in the book, like sort of like Freudian primitive, like sort of like a childlike place or a very old place, a place that just like sees suffering and sees the injustice of that suffering and wants to leave it as quickly as possible. And it's not really, and then that could be populated by some sort of like animal rights agenda or a politics of compassion or a harm reduction or something like that. But those are all downstream of just a raw emotionality. And so I've been like, just as a way of like moving through the world, I've been trying to like sit more into like raw emotionality. Like I just kind of notice when I'm feeling something before it becomes like rapidly territorialized by some sort of a story that aligns that feeling with the identity that I present, and that's sort of like just like tracing back to like sort of well springs of emotion.
Yeah, I think that's an important question for us, amidst the question of accelerationism. That's something I'd like to see a book on the Zero Horizons imprint, like a book on embodiment. What does that look like, now that we're 25 years into the social media phenomenon and we have been urged to touch grass when we are cut online. And I agree with you, like in my reading of James Hillman, the one thing that really stands out to me is his notion of the aesthetic and the kind of rapture of, like we can see something suffering, for example, like, fresh roadkill. It's one thing if it's a squirrel, it's another thing if it's a newborn fawn, right? And the kind of, moment that we can have with that. But even things that, like, I'm in the woods and I see things that I haven't seen in the past 25 years now all the time, every day, just out, in my binoculars the other day, just perusing the mountainside and then just seeing like a buck walk into view and having that, like that gasp, that inspiration of, a kind of immediate connectedness that allows everything else to dissipate for a moment. And almost wanting to hang on to that moment, not in a sort of sentimental sort of way, although there might be a risk of a kind of sentimentalism there, but just standing in observance of that kind of alterity and the sense of connection that I'm feeling in that moment seems to me to be like an apt starting point affectively for a kind of politics that's enlivening and makes me feel embodied. Right? Like that's the kind of place that I'm at without being atavistic in any sort of way. Right. And this is the challenge here. It's not just like, middle-class white guys living in the woods, enjoying themselves in their cabin while people are suffering down. But you know what I mean? Like there has to be like some kind of give there, or at least an acknowledgement, that this could be a kind of sentimentalist politics too. But at the same time, for me, there's a question of embodiment attends to the question of beauty, right? How we can be accepting of, even when it comes to things like just accepting our own body, like I forget who it was it? It was in that The Examined Life, that documentary that has Zizek and Judith Butler and Michael Hart in it. And in the section with Judith Butler and her friend she was disabled, she says something to that effect, like how much she loves being in her body, and she can feel like what it is that a body can do, and like no matter no matter what body that we have, there are moments, I think, at least in my case, like I was athletic when I was younger. I'm not like that now, and I can feel the limitations of my body. But there are these select moments where there's a kind of alignment, like where the being in the body and the acknowledgement of it and the sort of immediacy of it is beautiful, no matter how I look, no matter how I feel about myself, no matter any sort of judgment that's been projected on me. This is something for me that, like, from a political standpoint, seems to be preeminent over and above the question of everything else that we're talking about here. And I don't see it as a sentimentalism. I see it as a kind of enlivenment, right? And an immediacy that, I think is our lives. But anyway, that aside, I'm curious if anybody else has anything they want to add to that as we are at an hour and 10 minutes.
Mike, go for it.
Go for it, Mike.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a chance here, but I just want to build on what Sean was saying and what you're saying, and just want to say something. Like, I was also thinking about when I feel my body, and I run a 5K every morning. I live in some hills, and I feel in my body and then out of my mind. But maybe what we're encountering here, and this, I'm not trying to make a point so much as to say that in this cybernetic discussion, or as we get plugged into cybernetics more and more, and our minds start to detach from our bodies, like maybe the body is where we need to remind ourselves where we feel, where we feel that the weight of that transformation. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah,
I think one of the things that we risk losing, in the conceit of the accelerationist, at least in what Fisher's spelling out here, and what, the sort of danger that Baudrillard observes is this kind of loss. And, it's almost like the idea that a kind of intimacy with our real death, our impending death, affords us this intimacy with the body that, in a world where there's a sort of like continuous or infinite deferral of our lives, in some sense, we don't get that. This is Nietzsche's point exactly, is that when we consign ourselves to this idea that, oh, we have this immortal soul, and this is what I'm going to libidinally invest in, the thing that gets lambasted and discarded is the body. Right. And so I think you're onto something there, Mike. I'm with you.
Craig, that is the old flesh, Oh, sorry, Rachel, go for it.
Go for it, Rachel.
I have no idea how to put my hand down. Yes, there we go. I think I wanted to talk about exactly like pieces of all of those things. And I was like, I wanted to go back to Ashpool and demons. I always want to go back to demons. But we continue to kind of like circle around a couple of things like the body, death, and affect. I was thinking about, while I was reading all of this reading, I kept thinking about how the cybernetic space is indeed a demon, like even in the world that we inhabit is demonic in that, like, what does a demon do? And I was thinking like the Robert Johnson story, right? It's just kind of like you are promised kind of this future and the promise of, say, like indefinite life, like, you know, the this never-ending existence or whatever the we would like to have from our demon, the amazing guitar skills, is given at cost, right? So I think that the exchange, like this is the thing that wasn't really brought to the surface in the demonic kind of metaphor that is being used here. And I'm always gonna harp on the metaphors. I'm sorry, it's my thing, but like I think that it's underneath everything that we're talking about, in that like there is like this, like how do we like handle this like empathetic response, this like physical response to the cybernetic world. Like how do we like embody that? It's just like, well, there's probably some exchange that is going to naturally I keep kind of thinking about this like demonic exchange. It's almost like kind of happening with it. It's like our the flow is kind of we're sitting and, you know, we need to go out and touch the grass, otherwise we're actually going to die. We will not have this eternal life. It's just kind of like you're being trapped by the demon. So I think that there's an interesting kind of use case, which brings us back to this like the Gothic and the Gothic materialism. But I kind of keep circling around that. What does that mean for us as future thinkers? Because that the demonic exchange also really, really depends on you thinking about the future. You must dream in order to want enough to sign your name over to Facebook or what have you. So yeah, that's it.
You know, you bring up
I mean,
an excellent.
that's oh, sorry.
No, oh, no, go ahead, Adam. I'll say my bit after.
I mean, it's a brilliant way of phrasing. I mean, the demonic exchange. I mean, the idea is that, you know, the demon cannot propagate on their own. They need humans to propagate for them, and therefore they give you something almost like, you know, Goethe's Faust, and therefore it allows you to get something out of it. But also, you you become their vessel, their reproductive. You become their organ in a way. You become the organ. You know, I mean, this is kind of what we're doing right now, to be honest, in the sense of like, you know, social media, we get the extent we can, you know, I can see all of you, despite the fact you're hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. We can see each other on this basis, but the deal is that it's recorded, you know, and ultimately, if you think about AI, I mean, what was the most sort of sad or sort of you know, or worrying or enraging cases of this is people who didn't know what deal they was making with said devil. You know, I mean, something goes on like a Tupac, Ronnie James Dio, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe. They're all holograms now. They can all be holograms. They will never be allowed to. Yes, you'll get this fame, but also the image that you'll be converted into will forever be synonymous with you, will outlast you. I mean, even so that, for example, you know, the social media is an extension of the printing press in many ways. We're constantly writing all the time, and something can train you. You could probably train a few things on my Twitter posts or other people like wider circle, and I could probably keep on tweeting for centuries after I'm dead. Anyone who uses Twitter enough or any social media enough can keep posting after they're dead. People who write enough can keep writing after they're dead. I mean, we've got fucking Bill Gates talking to Socrates, and he doesn't even write, and Socrates didn't even write anything. The sort of the demonic propagation is we've made an allegiance with this capitalist image, which will then keep using us to reproduce itself, because how it reproduces itself is through commodities. And what commodities we have now? Data is a great commodity. It's how it trains itself. Obviously, it's not going to learn very much from the same masturbatory thing again and again. That's why it's kind of doomed. But it's the demon has already kind of got it. I mean, even capital, you know, the allegiance is okay. if you sort of make a deal with this sort of not necessarily greed demon, but sort of this addictive positive feedback loop of always constantly getting more and more returns, you can live a life better than anyone else on the planet, but you'll be kind of addicted to it. I mean, Musk made a deal with essentially a demon called Twitter, and he's now addicted to, the richest man in the world gives a shit what someone called Cat Turd 2 thinks on Twitter. This is the first time in human history this has ever happened. That someone with that much power over life and death is one, not even conscious of it, two, is so dependent on the affirmation of strangers, the feedback from their own writing, their own posting, because it's very similar to the printing press. Everyone can print and publish on the basis that all the feedback can come instantaneously from anyone else. And therefore, the very process of writing becomes, one, faster, and two, possibly criticism becomes faster. And so there's this sort of paranoiac tendency accelerates. And this could be a critique of Fisher in a way. The demons are already here, and they were the ones running the place. They weren't the ones that were being escaped. They weren't the ones escaping this theological setup. I mean, we could read this a little bit in his essay Terminator versus Avatar. He's like, it's not Terminator against it's Avatar. The idea, not the movie from James Cameron. Although I think actually Avatar is a great example of this earlier work, because so in Avatar, the mining corporation make these fake bodies. They generate these fake bodies of the Na'vi. A human gets placed into them through a communications technology, because it's a mind link, it's a cybernetic technology. But because Jake Sully makes an allegiance with that natural environment that exceeds the human, he can then turn their own technology against them in this very classically Maoist sort of protracted people's war that lasts 2 movies, 20 years in our time. So maybe something worse, but in terms of the demon, I'm very pessimistic, because we're losing the question of the body in that sense. Because yes, you can think about your body, or you can start posting more and get affirmation for the image of yourself, which you sort of fade into through the screen. I'm working on a book on this kind of thing actually, but the idea of fading into the text. But Craig, I would say some stuff as well.
Well, I think you kind of covered the bases, Adam, but I just want to highlight again what I think is an important reality about the demonology of Mark Fisher here, which is there is a logic of exchange. There is a cost. There is a Faustian bargain that we are seeing with, the cybernetics in Fisher's view. And, the question of whether this can be transposed to a politics of liberation, I think also then presupposes that there will be, some kind of economy of exchange, some sort of sacrifice, will need to be made. It's interesting too, thinking of demonology in terms of Nietzsche yet again, who, in espousing his theory of the eternal return, what does he say? Imagine that a demon comes to you, in the night and whispers in your ear and says, if you had to live this moment over and right, we all know that story. And so there is something of like an economics, even within the idea of an eternal return, which is that the thing that will be exacted from you is the very suffering again and again, infinitely. And the question is whether you will rise to the occasion to overcome it with a resounding yes, which I mean, in a sense, could probably be the most distilled version of the economics that we are talking about here. Can one assert themselves, as a subject, as a human will, over and over again, if our lives or if our bodies were operationalized in this infinite circuit, which I find profoundly interesting. Cool. Anybody else want to hop in with anything? We are at the hour and 20 minutes, so maybe we'll get like 1 or 2 more people in before we wrap up, if there's any lingering concerns. I mean, I'm good on my end. Cool. Well, with that said, I know some of you will appear. Oh, wait, hold on. Fisher and Futurologist has something. Yeah, Rachel, addicted to shit posting. I blame the demon. Yeah, we need to talk to Cooper about that. We're
going to get will and exorcism. Don't worry. By the way, we've got a priest. Like, we're going to get will and exorcism. We've got the holy water going.
Yeah, if any of our folks know, our dear Will on our, well, he's going through it right now, so we're going to call a priest. But Fisherian futurologist says, can someone explain this quote from Anti-Oedipus to me? Let's see if we can do it. The one according to which the apparent subject never ceases to live and travel as one, capital O, one never stops and one never has done with dying, and the other according to which is the same subject fixed as I actually dies, which is to say finally ceases to die, since it ends up dying, in the reality of a last instant that fixes it in this way as an I, all the while undoing the intensity, carrying it back to the zero that envelops it. Yeah. So this to me, sounds like basically a rendering of a particular notion of their desubjectivation, and this escaping of the self-reflexive notion of I here. I've spoken quite a bit. Adam, at a glance, do you have anything on that?
Well, I mean, the I die. Well, this isn't the case anymore, as we've spoken about with Tupac, Ronnie James Dio, and Elvis. But when you died, you used to die. The I can never essentially have any more experience that would modify itself to the side of its own experience. It becomes a dead I, which is purely its own recording. It's only what its traces. A last instant that fixes it in this way as an I, all while undoing an intensity, carrying it back to the zero that envelops it. It is literally a 0 degree of experience. So the I is no longer experiencing any intensity, which therefore means there's no experience going, and therefore it's very Kantian as well. There's no reality to the I's experience because there's no intensity to it. It just goes back to the zero. It sinks back into the continuum in a way. When one dies, it's rather the activity that if one's body, which is life, which is animation, simply sinks back down. The location, if they're going to be like properly fully on empiricist about it, the location of experience in a way is still there. It's just there's no intensity to experience. It's like in a way, for example, it's like for example, I've got a sound file, I'm playing it, and the volume is like up on the meter, and it drops. It's the same location, the sound's happening in the same place, it's a 0 degree. And the mechanisms to produce that sound again are gone. It's like, I've got a guitar plugged into an interface, I'm playing the sound is going through the guitar into the audio processor. I stop playing, somehow the guitar dies, in the sense of a switch blows, a fuse blows, something inside blows, it's dead, it's fucked, you can't fix it. That's more or less what they're talking about here. The location is the same, but there's no intensity there. And therefore, the means of producing that intensity have also been deactivated from that location. Therefore, it's no longer operative.
There's actually something that, if you're interested in the notion of intensity, especially with its relationship to the ego as an I, I've been looking at Pierre Klosowski's Living Currency. I mean, really, his book on Nietzsche is probably the go-to on this, but it's important to note that, I mean, Deleuze, Foucault, all those guys, they really borrowed from Klosowski, especially not only this notion of the simulacrum, which Deleuze and Baudrillard take, but the idea of intensity itself as juxtaposed with the notion of intention, right? Whereas it's in the ego and in the I that intentions are manifest, and those can come to die. Or like when the ego as an I comes to die, the intention comes to die, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the intensities come to die, because in the depersonalization of the ego, what we tend to access are all of those intensities that are excluded by the ego experience. Now, this can happen in many ways. It could happen in a hallucinatory experience, or it can happen in the way that Mark Fisher's talking about in this book, which is the infinite deferral of death through one becoming a hologram, right? The intensities of our lives being converted into holographic content and then being merged, maybe with future songs or singing the national anthem or happy birthday or what have you, right? One's I does not need to persist in order for those intensities to be appropriated by cybernetic capital, semio capital, and so forth. And so we see Fisher as one interpretation of that. But of course, there's I guess what we could say is like a more metaphysical or /religious or /phenomenological interpretation of this section of Anti-Oedipus. I think what we're getting here is the cybernetic semiocapital version of that. Cool. Anything else? Well, I think we will shut it down for now. Some of you will see later today in the Bataille reading group, but great turnout for June for a nice sunny summer day here in the US. Scalding hot for those Britons, as they say, Englanders.
We deserve it. We deserve it. It's fine. But my God, the study is boiling.
Yeah. You look pink right now. All right. Well, cool. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next time. We appreciate you showing up. Take care.
Cheers, everyone. Catch you later.
Thanks.